science, so bringing teams of people together here at the center to tackle a wide range of topics under different initiatives that focus on different themes or geographies. We bring people together to provide training on how to use environmental data science tools and increasingly AI tools to accelerate the work they do. And of course, producing and providing the results and tools that come from that research to help support people who are doing on-the-ground conservation and management around the world. So please look into the center if you're interested in getting involved. We have opportunities all the time for people to propose projects or to work with NCs in partnership, and we look forward to hearing from you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sophia to introduce our speaker.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. And yes, welcome everyone. And thank you all for joining us for our 6th annual NC Seminar Series. And today we have the pleasure of welcoming Patricia Balvanera, our 3rd speaker in this series. So this year, our series is centered around the theme of environmental data science and its impacts on communities and ecosystems. I'm Sofia Lacona Manos, and I am a data analyst at NCs, and I'm joined by the rest of the Seminar Series Planning Committee. At NCs, we work to accelerate scientific discoveries that enhance our understanding of the world and benefit people and nature, as well as to transform the scientific culture to be more open, efficient, and collaborative. And before we begin, we ask you to join us in acknowledging the Chumash peoples, who are the environmental stewards of the land on which NCs is located. We pay our respects to the Chumash peoples and their elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. We acknowledge that this land on which we live and work are the traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples, including the Chumash peoples. This land today is the result of the erasures and exclusions of Indigenous peoples. As we come together to bring awareness to issues of equity and justice, we recognize that the Chumash people and so many other Indigenous people are still fighting to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism in their tribal territories. As we continue to work towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in data science, we strive to prioritize Indigenous data sovereignty and self-determination. And now for just a bit of logistical information before we get started. For all of you joining us for this webinar, please feel free to add any questions you may have during the talk through the Q&A button that's located at the bottom of your screen. And once the presentation is over, we will have a moderated Q&A session with the questions that you all submit. And I'll also mention that we have some folks joining us in our lounge, which we invite to ask questions at the end. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patricia Balvanera, professor at the Institute for Ecosystem and Sustainability Research at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. For more than 2 decades, Dr. Balvanera's research has explored how nature and human well-being sustain one another, spanning ecosystem services, social ecological systems, relational values, and transformative change. She has collaborated with hundreds of researchers and knowledge holders from over 100 countries, and from 2018 to 2022, she co-chaired the IPBES Values Assessment, working with nearly 100 experts from 50 countries, whose foundings now inform the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. She's authored over 200 scientific publications, including work in Science, Nature, and PNAS, and currently serves as co-editor-in-chief of Ecology and Society. In Mexico, she helps pioneer ecosystem services research and currently co-leads Cocina Colaboratorio, working with communities in Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Mexico City to create just and sustainable food systems. And today she'll be sharing insights from the IPBES Values Assessment, reflecting on the methodological challenges of synthesizing over 50,000 pieces of evidence across 50 research protocols, and what it takes to integrate diverse knowledges in service of more just and sustainable futures. So Patricia, we're super excited to have you, and please go ahead. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Ben and Sofia, for the invitation. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen. Okay. So as Sofia mentioned, in this talk, I want to reflect on what it means to undertake a synthesis of knowledge that is plural, that recognizes different ways of understanding what knowledge is and how is knowledge generated and what makes robust knowledge, but also different ways of pulling together these different sources of knowledge in order to generate this collective collaborative science, of which I am totally passionate about, that makes a difference, because these syntheses that are done together, that are more plural, are relevant for many more people, and thus can have a much wider impact in society. And to reflect on this, and because this is a very kind invitation by NCs, I want to start by remembering a bit and reflecting upon 3 working groups. I was working in parallel, so I was 3, 4, 5 times a year in NCs for between 2010 and 2015. And I want to start with this as like a rationale for the background where I come from. And then we'll dig into the more recent work with IPBES. So during those years, I attended 3 very different working groups. One was on biodiversity and the functioning of ecosystems, translating results from model experiments into functional reality. You see some of the people who integrate this working group. And if you look at the description of the list of people, most of the people were based in US institutions, although there were people from other countries. I probably was the only one from the Global South. Oh no, there were 2. And most of the people were ecologists, and the people who were furthest away from being ecologists were foresters. And what we produced were really, really nice synthesis papers about the knowledge that was available then on the role of biodiversity in ecosystem functioning. And there were many papers, for instance, one on focusing only explicitly on the role of plants, our primary producers, and thus the diversity of plants in functions such as primary productivity and so on. And this work was analogous to a meta-analysis I had done many years before, which was the first database and meta-analysis on this issue the topic was really debated, and it was the first time there was real data to assess the different hypotheses. But already then, during that workshop, I was not 100% comfortable with staying with these rigorous meta-analyses, not because they're not rigorous, not because they're not relevant, but because they were very focused on a very narrow way of understanding evidence, data, and what kind of data we needed. So during that workshop, at that time, I invited some of the people who integrated the workshop, but also other colleagues, where rather than producing these meta-analyses, which were produced, of course, we discussed more on the challenges that had not been addressed. For instance, we focus on a few ecosystem services, and for instance, for forage, timber, and so on, we identify that most of the time, the function or the metric, the indicator of a function that is measured, has very little to do with the final ecosystem service that we really want to analyze. Of course, things like context-dependent patterns, and so really understanding that different results apply in different places, trade-offs between the different type of effects, and so on. And based on this, we really proposed that the design of experiments to assess the role of biodiversity in function would need to encompass the way these forests, for instance, are managed, why they're managed that way, so that the experiments would really be closer to what happens in nature. And actually, there's an experiment in Borneo with a huge amount of very smart people, some of them that were in this working group, that today is a very interesting example of what can be done. Then we had a totally different group of people. It was on cultural ecosystem services from marine and coastal systems, counting the intangible. And by the way, sorry, I forgot to say that the previous workshop was led by Brad Cardinal, and this other one was led by Kai Chan and Anne Gary. And it was a very interesting group of people. You can probably recognize Ben. Long time ago, I'm here also a long time ago, Gretchen Daly. And it was for me the very first time that I collaborated with people very much outside being ecologist and very much outside my zone of comfort. So there were economists, philosophers, people working very closely with local communities, social scientists like sociologists. Rachel Gould, for instance, was just a very young student, and now she's one of the editors-in-chief of People and Nature. So it was very interesting. Local communities, there were people from Hawaii that were there also, not scientists at all. And in that workshop, well, during those years, we were really trying to get, on one hand, to unpack what the Millennium Assessment had done in terms of the definition of this, what do we call cultural ecosystem services, but also to really think much further that what is really the cultural and social context of this concept, and what kind of data is needed, how to analyze it, and how to personalize a much more interdisciplinary analysis of ecosystem services. And a byproduct of this NC's workshop that came out later following several discussions was this paper led by Kai with people from that workshop, but also many other people that were incorporated later, on rethinking why is nature protected. And in this paper, we questioned the dichotomy between intrinsic values that focus on the nature for itself, independent of human needs, instrumental values, which are the values of nature as an instrument of people's well-being, and introduced the concept of relational values. Nature valued in terms of the relationships that people individually establish with nature, but also in the context of the relationships that people establish between themselves in the context of nature. And well, this has among other papers, really led to a total rethinking of sustainability science and the issue of values from a much more relational perspective. The third workshop initiative I was involved with at NCIS was of a very different nature. It was what is called a sustainability distributed graduate seminar, which basically was a graduate course was taught simultaneously by different institutions, and all these institutions had faculty that taught the course, but all those institutions had students who were officially part of this course at their institutions and got credits for taking this course. And the basic structure was that once a week, pre-loaded topics and lectures were discussed in each of the institutions between students and faculty at the institutions. And then once a week, all the institutions got together and we all discussed. So this went on for many, many years. So, between 2010 and 2015, and the institutions that were involved included, well, University of Minnesota was the sponsor, Janine Cavendish and Steve Polaski, but also in some iterations we had Princeton University, Columbia University, UNAM, several faculty at different iterations, Harvard University, Arizona State University, Florida International University, and Universidade de Sao Paulo. So a total of close to 250 students, postdocs, and faculty participated along these years. And what was very nice is that NCIS allowed us, supported us to have a workshop after several years to reflect on the initiative. And so we brought together students and faculty to discuss on this distributed graduate seminar. And there was a special issue in ecology and society that emerged from these discussions. And in particular, what was very interesting was that over the different discussions we had among institutions, it was very, very clear, especially to us in the Global South, that we had very different ways of understanding the challenges, of analyzing the challenges, of selecting key papers, of discussing these key papers, and that there were concepts such as equity, justice, that some of the institutions didn't think that were essential for sustainability and were essential for us. And what was very interesting is that after we finished, or maybe in the middle of writing the papers for the special issue, Janine Cavendish, who was the head of this initiative, came to Morelia. Now I'm based in Oaxaca, but I was then based in Morelia, which is west of Mexico City. Oaxaca is southeast of Mexico City. And when she came to Mexico and she saw the amount of effort that the students put into reading all these papers in English, understanding these different epistemologies, these different ways of understanding knowledge, and getting ready to connect and talk in English to these different faculty in different institutions, she realized the huge challenge, but she also realized that we were really talking about different things and that the context really mattered to understand what sustainability meant and how to personalize it. And as a result of those discussions, we came up with a framework where we assess trade-offs between two ecosystem services, and we assess the possibility frontiers for different combinations of these pairs of frameworks. And we understood that different stakeholders had different preferences for positions along this curve. And so sustainability meant very different ways. And in this figure, you see how in one paper, we had the framework, and in another one, we personalized it for Mexico, Midwestern US, Tanzania, and Kenya, and really reflected on how it really meant very different things in very different contexts. And so this was more or less 2010, 2015. And of course, I continued a lot of collaborations with a lot of people. And now I want to come to this assessment that I was lucky enough to be one of the co-chairs of, the assessment report on the diverse values and valuation of nature. And by then, like my colleagues, such as Kai Chan, Rachel Gould, and many others, had already discussed with us many ideas about these very different ways of knowing, very different ways of understanding nature and value nature. And so along this assessment, we really made a huge effort to try to be as plural and inclusive as possible. And so just as a bit of a background, you probably all know, but maybe some of you don't know, that in 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was published, and it was the first global initiative on the interface between people and nature from a very interdisciplinary perspective. At different, IPCC, of course, is growingly interdisciplinary, but very focused on climate. And inspired on this experience and the experience by IPCC, the IPBES, the platform, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, was created in 2012. A huge difference between IPBES and IPCC is that from its creation, IPBES was very conscious that biodiversity is very different in different parts of the world, and the way people interact with biodiversity and the different cultures that have been created around the world are totally different. And so if we really want to understand globally the challenges of biodiversity and ecosystem services, we need a very plural process in terms of types of knowledge, but also the regions from which people, where they live, where they see the challenges, where they generate science. And so IPBES divided the world into 5 regions. One is the rich countries, including US, Canada, Europe, and Australia. Then another one for the other part of Europe and Asia. Russia and a few countries of Asia. Then the other rest of countries of Asia, and then Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. And so any working group, any initiative by IPBES needs to have this configuration of authors, experts, and so on. one of the first products of this platform, IPBES, was a conceptual framework because the Millennium Assessment had taught all of us that a diagram such as this one can be very imperfect and very simplistic. But on the other hand, it is the Rosetta Stone, the only way to communicate with very different people, having in mind and having grown or experience or developed very different types of knowledge. And so these frameworks are extremely useful when undertaking the work in any of the working groups assessments by IPBES or by interdisciplinary work. So you can see here that you have a few boxes: good quality of life, institutions regulating the way nature is modified, then nature, then the benefits from nature modified by the assets, and these linking back to quality of nature. But what was very interesting is that because of this diversity of people, experts, academics, getting together to develop this framework, there were really very strong discussions about what do we mean by good quality of life. Census, World Bank, and many initiatives, you can define it, for instance, as human well-being, and there are indicators. But there were people from the Global South saying, no, no, no. We need to think about living in harmony with nature, living well in balance and harmony with Mother Earth. And so that's why also nature, you have biodiversity and ecosystem services, but also Mother Earth or systems of life. And you have also nature's benefit to people that can be called ecosystem services or goods, but also nature's gifts. And these discussions led to internal discussions with the IPBES about the need to really tease apart these different ways of understanding nature, these different ways of valuing nature. And there was a small working group of maybe 60, 50 people that was convened by IPBES to deliver a preliminary guide regarding the diverse conceptualizations of the values of nature. And I really arrived, as many things in my life, I arrived to this working group due to several circumstances of life that I could not control, but being there was extremely enriching. And this was initially an internal guide and then became a guide for all IPBES assessments, where we discussed that there's all these different types of evaluation, one undertaken by indigenous and local communities, some undertaken from the lens of social contributions to nature, the well-being of people and so on. Other lenses more from the economic, well, which probably would be, here, and the ecological, and that most initiatives were based on a single worldview, but that an encompassing approach would need to take into account all these layers and to focus on nature, its contributions to people, and what a good quality of life means. And that this would really be relevant to policy objectives, not only economic, but also environmental and social, but that most economic valuation is only seeing this mainstream approach, using relatively simplistic approaches that are based on that lead to the design of economic incentives, but a pluralistic valuation would need to integrate these dimensions, these type of policies, these very different types of knowledges would emerge from deliberative processes where the power relations among types of knowledges would be addressed and leveraged, and that would integrate into policies for different sectors. And after that, we then were able to start the values assessment. And what's well, very atypical is that we were 4 co-chairs. Most of the assessment have 3. Unai Pascual from Spain, Brigitte Baptiste from Colombia, Mike Christie from in UK, Scotland, Scotland, I think. And we were very lucky because we had a team, a technical support unit that was very big because of the support of UNAM on top of the support by IPBES. And we had a very, very diverse team of authors. So if we reflect on the 4 years of the assessment, considering all the people that contributed, not just main authors, we had 95 nominated experts from 47 countries, but we had also 200 contributing authors, many of them, well, at least in terms of previous assessment, were indigenous knowledge holders, many social scientists, many disciplines, and the technical support unit was based in Mexico. So we had authors meetings, but of course, we had COVID in the middle, one online, and then 2 face-to-face, external reviews from the government, a liaison group working on indigenous and local knowledge. We had 3 workshops, one in an indigenous area of Mexico, the final one because of COVID was online. And in the end, we reviewed we considered 200,000 pieces of evidence, of which we concentrated on 50,000. So these 50,000 pieces of evidence included valuation studies, study sites, analysis, documents from the gray literature from the different countries, contributions from indigenous peoples, reports from the identification of future scenarios, the analysis of policy instruments, data sets, and by United Nations and others, and theories. And we had 29 different assessment protocols. So from the beginning, the co-chairs, we discussed and invited our teams of authors to be very plural and to think about knowledge and synthesis of knowledge in very different ways. So we had the classical, really structured review with search streams and search terms, such as the ones, for instance, in one of the working groups I showed you. But we had semi-structured reviews that combined expert-based criteria. We had non-structured reviews that were totally based on expert criteria of very diverse teams. We had also invited contributions from experts, reports, articles, and combinations of all of those. Also, we tried to rely on a very diverse and plural set of tools to analyze this huge amount of data. So for instance, the filtering of many sources was done with all these large language models. We used mixed methods, including quantitative assessments of frequencies, correlations, clusters, geographic analysis, but many qualitative approaches, no? Content analysis, analysis of structure, constructs, but also identification of archetypes. And we constantly combine inductive approaches like the generation and synthesis with deductive approaches with the preparation of hypotheses to be tested. And with all this, I just want to go to the main results and main messages emerging from this. And our main message is that the way nature is valued in political and economic decisions is both a key driver of the global biodiversity crisis, but also a vital opportunity to address it. And this is backed by the fact that we all know that over millennia around the world, people have developed very different ways of understanding and connecting with nature, which has led to a very different types of ways to assess the values of nature and its contributions to people. We developed a typology to help guide decisions based on the revision of a huge amount of literature from economics, from all the disciplines, but also with all this expert knowledge, indigenous local knowledge. And we came up with this diagram where you have different layers, which are the worldviews, and knowledge systems, which are the outer layer. Which are the ways we conceive the world and we conceive knowledge. The second layer is about the broad values, the societal values, the way we think we should live. Is it what we want to achieve prosperity, or do we want to promote reciprocity? Which leads then to the specific values, where the intrinsic values, instrumental values, and relational values I presented a while ago are relevant, and all these are assessed by value indicators. But also we understood that different people in different contexts, from different roles, understand these layers in very different ways. So for instance, we can think about living from nature, like river resources, which would mean that we would emphasize maybe worldviews focus on the needs of people, anthropocentric worldviews, where maybe the broad values are prosperity and instrumental values, nature as an instrument of people's well-being would be critical, and maybe indicators such as the market value in US dollars of this fish would be relevant. But there are other ways to look at this layer, for instance, living in the riverine landscape, living with the riverine species and landscape, or living as the river as part of us. And maybe here the worldviews would be much more pluricentric, where nature and people and the cosmos are important, where broad values such as reciprocity and care would be important, where specific values such as these relational values, the way people relate with nature and how the kinds of relationships they establish with nature would be relevant, and value indicators such as tracing, for instance, these value indicators in informal norms or in cultural behavior or in arts would be relevant. And we analyze a bit more like with details economic and political decisions. We understand economic decisions between private actors, while political decisions are those undertaken by governments, in principle to support common good. And all this has tended to prioritize a narrow set of nature's values, where they prioritize market-based instruments, market-based instrumental values, and also intrinsic values that can jeopardize the local values of people. And I will go a bit quicker to get to the end. And we identified that there's really not a shortage of methods. And we did a typology of these types of methods in nature-based, statement-based, behavior-based, integrated evaluation. We identified the importance of the evaluation processes that have been taking for millennia in indigenous territories, but with locally established procedures. We identified that stakeholders very rarely participate in many of the evaluation processes that are relevant for them, and that most of the evaluation studies that are published by academics are not uptaken by policy decisions. We identify different types of power and how they operate to establish the dominance of certain types of values. And we define a step-by-step evaluation process to be much more inclusive. We explore different future scenarios, and we identify 4 leverage points or key interventions that would have from shallow to very deep impacts on the evaluation of natures by recognizing these values, including them in decisions, changing the institutions that decide how to include them, and by rethinking how we think about the future and what is desirable. These findings have made it to, like the operationalization, for instance, of the 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and have also been very important for many types of actors. Yet, and with this I finish, the plurality and inclusion was insufficient. When analyzing this evidence, we found that the region of origin of the first author or the region of focus of the papers was very biased to the global north, with most of the papers based on the rich countries. That most of the sources we documented were academic. And we analyzed which approach to data synthesis conveyed more diversity, but I will not have time enough to discuss. But basically, we found that non-structured reviews and invited contributions from non-academic sources also allowed to incorporate a much wider diversity of perspectives. And after that, we launched, and it's already finished, a special issue about the values assessment, in which the authors further reflected on procedural inequities and ontological inequities, inequities in terms of the representations, the different ways we conceive the world. In synthesis, along my career path, I have been embracing wider and wider plurality of different ways of knowing, but also different ways of generating this collective knowledge and finding ways to synthesize it. The IPBES Values Assessment provided unique opportunities for this plural synthesis, and yet afterthoughts identify some really important structural and procedural inequities to really allow for much more plural and inclusive process. And with this, I'd like to finish and thank you very much, and would be happy to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Patty. Thank you so much for that insightful and informative talk. We're open to accepting questions for Patty. There should be a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen, so you can enter your questions there. To give everyone a little thinking time, our committee has an initial question to ask. I like this question here. For researchers in the audience who want to incorporate plural values into their own synthesis work, what is one practical first step that you would recommend for them?
Yes, thank you. So I think one very important first step is to really try to place yourself in the context in which you are working. Very often, researchers already come with their own ontologies, with their own ways of thinking about the world, and with their own epistemologies, their ways of thinking about what is knowledge and how to organize it, and already have their hypotheses ready. And they just go to these areas with a priori hypothesis. So I think the very first step is to really take the time to visit the area, to establish direct personal contact with the people in the area, take time to have tea. And many colleagues talk about tea for transdiscipline in terms of tea because it starts with the tea, but taking time to have a slow cup of tea, maybe going to the plot if they're agriculturists, to the forest, there are foresters, to maybe they're fishing and see how they're fishing, and to really try to sense who is there and what are the very diverse types of knowledge. And from there, I would argue that our typology and the accompanying papers would be really useful to start identifying which types of knowledge are present. And from there, well, it depends how much you want to dig into each of them or just understand this complexity. You can go further, but this would be, for me, a very important way to start.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I love that advice. And we were chatting a little bit at the beginning, but and so we have our coffee area, we've got our tea area. So always a great way to start a conversation. From the audience, we have a question from Kobsanes, and they say, thank you for your stimulating and expansive work and talk. Your research strikes me as a form of consensus building among many ways of knowing. Can you share your perspective on viewing science and your research as a form of consensus building among diverse worldviews versus science as one worldview among many?
Okay, this is such an interesting question. So I think for many years, I really would have argued that yes, this would be to form a consensus. Actually, the way my own trajectory and the way many of these working groups work, consolidate papers, is some kind of consensus. Because you need to agree on, for instance, this conceptual framework to be able to write about it. But then a lot has been written of people who collaborate in IPBES and other initiatives about the fact that there's a danger in consensus, because when you generate consensus, there tends to be a voice, a person, a framework, an approach that dominates. And then people start, yes, refining, amplifying and consolidating. And many voices have cautioned about the dangers of consensus. So right now, so why? Because different people would have very different ideas. But of course, if everybody stays in their idea, it would be impossible to generate collective knowledge. So the way I see it now is that you first need to recognize the differences. You really need to acknowledge that there are very different ways of understanding. And then gradually you converge to an area of convergence. And I wouldn't use consensus because maybe, like in some groups, for instance, they use tools such as I agree with this and I love it, or I do not agree with this, but I can live with this idea. And so this area of convergence allows to recognize that not everything there's full consensus, but that it does emerge from the collective, and the collective is happy to endorse what emerges.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. I love how you walked us through the difference between consensus and then being able to live with it and working through everyone's ideas, not just one dominant view in the room. We've got, I think, time probably for one more question. This is from folks in the lounge at NCs. Is it important to have multiple methods of synthesis to capture the most perspectives? Or does the method depend or vary by the region or people you want to engage?
Okay, so I will step just a little bit backwards. And the issue is that we had so many discussions, for instance, during the values assessment about how philosophers, political sciences, anthropologists, sociologists, ecologists, geographers, and let me stay first in academia, how these people trained in these different disciplines understand what knowledge is, what a robust method to generate knowledge or generate synthesis is. And we had so many different perspectives. So in this particular case, that the nature of the topic we were addressing, which were the diverse values of nature, and the nature of the configuration of the working groups, they were in parallel, so many working groups analyzing different sources of data in different ways. For us, it was very important to have these very different ways of identifying which data we were going to analyze and developing the protocols to analyze. And what was very interesting is that when the values assessment was published, you publish through IPBES in this platform called Zenodo, but also each of the protocols from each of the working groups in each of the chapters were published. And it was very interesting to see that probably during the first 6 months, there were thousands, tens of thousands of people downloading these protocols. So just thinking out of the box in different types of ways of searching for data, thinking about the questions to be addressed, thinking together about how to analyze this data in very diverse ways was already an important contribution that many audiences, and we don't know, there were downloads, I don't know from whom, but there were tens of thousands of downloads of these protocols in the first months. So I would argue that a diverse set of protocols is important to address a complex issue, questions such as the one we had in hand.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so exciting to see those downloads. It's clearly a very needed question and work. And I'll use that opportunity to wrap up for today. We really want to thank you for being here and speaking with us today. We're so proud to have connections like you through NCs and your deep ties to NCs working groups from many years ago. We'd love to see the old photos of then, of course. I'll just use this opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the upcoming events we have at NCs. We've started to host these debates on draft at Validation Ale. It's a local pub here in Santa Barbara. And Ben goes up against another scientist to discuss an important topic. This one will be on wildfires in California on August 25th at Validation Ale. For folks in the audience who might want to join, we have a QR code here. But there's lots of ways to stay involved with NCs, including just being part of our newsletter or connecting with our website. Lots of opportunities to stay connected. This is our last seminar for this series of this year, but again, please stay involved with us on our events calendar. And finally, join me again in thanking Patricia Balvanera for speaking today. We really appreciate the time you took to share your knowledge with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the